He mopped floors, kept to himself. What hidden past could turn a whisper into a salute? No one knew his name. But when a Navy SEAL saw the tattoo on his forearm and whispered, "Sir," everything stopped because the man they'd ignored wasn't supposed to exist anymore. If stories like this give you chills, subscribe now. This one's going to stay with you. Most people at the Langston Naval Research Annex didn't even know the janitor's name. Hell, I'm not sure anyone bothered to ask. He was just there every morning before the sun came up. Every evening, long after the last office light went out. Pushing that squeaky cart with the broken wheel, wearing the same faded Navy jumpsuit that looked like it had seen better decades. You know how it is with people who work those invisible jobs. The cleaning crew, the maintenance guys, the security guards on the night shift. They become part of the background, human furniture. You walk past them 1,000 times and never really see them. The younger staff called him the old guy who never smiles. The security guards barely glanced up when he badged in at 4 a.m. sharp every single day for 2 years straight. Same routine, same route, same methodical silence, day after day after day. His name was Samuel Kane, but nobody knew that either. Nobody cared enough to look past the name tag that was so faded you couldn't read it anyway. Nobody knew he kept his mop handle in his right hand to hide the scar tissue wrapped around his left knuckles like twisted rope. Souvenirs from a night in Kandahar when he'd had to fight his way out of an ambush with nothing but his bare hands and a broken radio. Nobody noticed how he always, and I mean always, checked the emergency exits before he started mopping a new section. Muscle memory from 30 years of operations, where knowing your exit routes meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. Nobody thought it was strange that he'd pause outside the server room each night, just listening to those cooling fans hum, head tilted like he was analyzing something. They figured he was just an old man taking a breather. What they didn't know was that Kane could identify the sound signature of different server configurations in his sleep. Could tell you which systems were running hot, which ones were being accessed remotely, which ones shouldn't be online at all. Old habits die hard when those habits kept you alive for 3 decades. Could this janitor hold a forgotten legend? They should have noticed. But when you're invisible long enough, people stop seeing you altogether. And Samuel Kane had been perfecting the art of invisibility since the day he'd been told his country needed him to disappear. The day everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I can picture it perfectly because I've heard this story from 3 different people now, and they all remember it the same way, probably because it's the kind of moment that burns itself into your memory. A group of recently deployed SEALs was getting the standard dog and pony tour through the secure wing. You know the drill. Show the young operators how their intelligence gets processed, where their mission briefs come from. Make them feel connected to the bigger machine. Young guys sharp as razor blades, the kind who still had that look in their eyes, like they could take on the world and win. Kane was mopping the main corridor when they passed. Didn't look up, didn't break stride, didn't even slow down, just kept working like he always did, like he was part of the architecture. The group was loud, animated, talking about their last deployment in voices that carried that particular mix of adrenaline and exhaustion that comes from being young and having just survived something most people couldn't imagine. But one of them, the youngest, maybe 24, with blonde hair cut high and tight and shoulders that hadn't learned to carry the weight yet, he stopped. Just stopped dead in his tracks like he'd walked into an invisible wall. The others kept walking, their voices echoing down the hallway, talking about some bar fight in Djibouti or a poker game in Qatar. But this kid, Marcus Chen, though nobody knew his name yet either, he was staring not at Kane's face, not at his uniform, at his forearm. because Kane's sleeve had pulled up just enough when he'd reached to wring out his mop, just enough to show it. A tattoo in tight black script, faded by decades, but still readable to someone who knew what to look for. MWD Kilo K9 Unit, Tora Bora 803. To most people, it would have looked like any other military tattoo. Every veteran's got ink telling their story, right? But Marcus had grown up in the community. His father was Navy, his uncle was Army Special Forces, and his older brother had done too. Tours with Marine Recon before an IED sent him home early. Marcus knew military tattoos, and he knew that MWD stood for Military Working Dog, and he knew that Tora Bora in 03 meant something very specific, something that was whispered about in the community, but never talked about officially. The kid's breath caught in his throat. You could hear it in the sudden silence, and then so quiet you almost missed it. Barely more than a whisper, he said, "Sir?" Kane looked up. For the first time in God knows how long, he actually looked up from his work and made eye contact with someone. Their eyes met across 8 feet of polished linoleum, and something shifted in the air between them. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. The kind that goes bone deep. The kind that speaks to something primal about warriors recognizing other warriors, even across decades in different uniforms, and the vast gulf between legend and reality. Could this moment awaken a buried truth? The SEAL took a step back like he'd seen a ghost, which in a way he had. "Something wrong, petty officer." One of the instructors called back, noticing that their group was suddenly one man short, but Marcus couldn't answer. His mouth was dry, his heart was hammering, and he just kept staring at that tattoo like it was going to disappear or transform into something else, because in his mind he was doing the math. Tora Bora, 2003, MWD Kilo, the stories his instructor at Bud's used to tell after a few beers, always ending with, "But that unit never officially existed, and if anyone asks, I never told you this story." "Chen, you coming or what?" Marcus forced himself to move to catch up with the group, but he kept looking back over his shoulder at the janitor who had gone back to mopping like nothing had happened. Within 10 minutes of the tour ending, Marcus was in the bathroom with his phone out typing a text to his old instructor. "Hey, Master Chief, need to ask you about something. Call me when you get this. It's important." Within an hour, his phone was ringing. "Chen, what's this about? You sounded spooked." "Master Chief, those stories you used to tell us about the ghost teams, the K9 units that worked off books, you ever mention a unit called MWD Kilo?" Long silence on the other end. "Then where did you hear that name?" "I think I just met one of them. He's working as a janitor at Langston Naval Research." Another silence, longer this time. "That's impossible, son. Those men are all dead. Are you sure about that?" By afternoon, someone at the Pentagon was having a very bad day because word travels fast in certain circles. And when word spreads that a man who was supposed to be dead 20 years ago is pushing a mop cart through a secure facility, people start making phone calls. The kind of phone calls that wake up retired colonels and make civilians in expensive suits very nervous. They tried to handle it delicately at first. You know how bureaucrats are always hoping they can make problems disappear with the right combination of paperwork and plausible deniability. "Sir, we just need to verify some information for our records," the young officer said, trying to sound official but not threatening. He'd been sent by someone way above his pay grade to have what his superiors called an informal conversation with the janitor. Kane was in the supply closet, taking inventory of cleaning supplies with the same methodical precision he'd once used to inventory ammunition and medical supplies for forward operating bases. He looked at the officer with those gray eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had watched friends die and enemies surrender and civilians caught in between pay the price for both. I already gave you everything 20 years ago, he said, not stopping his count of toilet paper rolls. That one sentence hit the officer like a punch to the gut, because it confirmed what they'd all been hoping wasn't true. That sentence sent ripples through the chain of command like a stone through still water. Within hours, secure phone lines were buzzing between the Pentagon, Langley, and facilities whose names don't appear on any organizational chart. Because the last time anyone had seen Master Chief Samuel Kane, he was bleeding out in a cave system near the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, with half a mountain on top of him and enemy fire turning the air around him into flying metal. The after-action report was stamped with so much classified ink, it looked like abstract art. The mission had been so far off the books that even the black budget didn't have a line item for it. The only reason his name wasn't etched into the memorial wall was because officially Samuel Kane and his entire unit had never existed in the first place. But here he was, graying at the temples, wearing a janitor's uniform with his name tag so faded you couldn't read it, asking if they needed him to empty the trash cans before he left for the day. The Pentagon liaison who showed up that evening was a man named Colonel Davidson, 30 years in military intelligence, the kind of guy who'd seen enough classified files to know that reality is usually stranger and messier than fiction. He pulled a file marked Echo Ash 23 from his briefcase, one of only 3 copies in existence. Inside, one photograph that was mostly shadows and redacted text. One paragraph of mission summary that was more black ink than actual words, and a red diagonal stamp that read, Deceased, Presumed Kane, 04152004. Except Samuel Kane was standing right in front of him, very much alive, and asking if anyone wanted coffee from the break room. Master Chief, Davidson said, and something in his voice made it clear this wasn't a question. We need to talk. Kane nodded once. Conference room B is empty. I cleaned it an hour ago. They sat across from each other at a table that Kane had been wiping down with disinfectant every day for 2 years. Davidson spread the file contents on the table like he was dealing cards. Why didn't you come back? He finally asked. After Tora Bora, after everything went sideways, why didn't you come home? Kane looked at the photograph. 8 men in desert camouflage, faces mostly obscured by shadows and tactical gear, but their eyes visible. Young eyes, confident eyes, eyes that belonged to men who believed they were making a difference. They told me not to, he said simply. You see, after Tora Bora, after the mountain came down and the world went quiet, except for the sound of his own breathing and the distant whine of incoming helicopters, after Kane had pulled 2 bleeding men out of a collapsed tunnel, while enemy fire chewed up the rocks around him like angry insects, after he'd carried them both to safety on a leg that was definitely broken and maybe shattered. After all that, he'd found something in that mountain that changed everything. A laptop, hard drives, documents in multiple languages, financial records, communication logs, proof that certain American contractors had been selling intelligence to the highest bidder. Proof that someone wearing the same uniform Kane wore had been trading the lives of American soldiers for deposits in Swiss bank accounts. When Kane tried to report it through proper channels, funny thing happened. His commanding officers went quiet when he walked into a room. His security clearance got reviewed for reasons that were never quite explained. His medical leave got extended indefinitely, while paper pushers shuffled his file between departments that didn't seem to exist. And then one gray morning at Walter Reed, while Kane was learning to walk again on a titanium leg that would never quite feel right, A black helicopter landed on the hospital's helipad. Two men in expensive suits walked into his room without knocking, sat down in chairs they hadn't been offered, and presented him with a choice that wasn't really a choice at all: disappear and live quietly. Somewhere far from anyone who might recognize him or keep talking about what he'd found and be remembered as a traitor who'd compromised national security and gotten good men killed with his reckless accusations. They had documents ready to prove their version of events. Testimony from surviving team members who swore Kane had disobeyed direct orders, evidence that he'd been psychologically unstable, suffering from PTSD-induced paranoia. All of it fabricated, but convincing enough to destroy what was left of his life if he chose to fight it. He chose silence. Vanished into the contractor system like a ghost fading into morning mist. Changed his name from Samuel Kane to Sam Carson with paperwork that was frighteningly easy to obtain. Shaved the beard that had been part of his identity for 15 years. Buried the medals so deep in a storage unit in Colorado that he sometimes forgot which state he'd left them in. But he never stopped watching. Never stopped listening to the radio chatter on frequencies that officially didn't exist. Never stopped being exactly what he'd trained to be for 30 years. A hunter, a tracker, a man who could disappear into any environment and become part of the landscape. The janitor job at Langston was perfect. Security clearance required, but not too deep. Background checks that were thorough enough to be convincing, but not thorough enough to dig up graves that were supposed to stay buried. And access, maybe not to classified information, but to classified people. People who might someday need the kind of help that only a ghost could provide. And that tattoo, that was his one act of rebellion. His way of saying, I was here. We existed. Some of us still do. The SEAL who spotted it, Marcus Chen, had grown up hearing stories about the old school operators. His instructor at EBUD-S, Master Chief Rodriguez, had served with men who'd served with legends. Men who could track enemy movement patterns 3 days out just by reading wind patterns and bird behavior. Men who could slip through hostile territory like smoke, who once held off an entire insurgent cell for 18 hours with nothing but a Barrett 50 cal, and the kind of stubbornness that only comes from knowing that good men are depending on you to not quit. Rodriguez used to tell these stories after training when the young SEALs were exhausted and their defenses were down, and they were ready to hear about what excellence actually looked like, always ending with the same warning. But that unit never officially existed, and if anyone asks, I never told you any of this. Marcus had always thought they were just stories, war stories, the kind that get bigger and more impossible every time they're told until reality becomes legend and legend becomes myth. Could this janitor be the myth made real? Turns out the legend was real, and he'd been emptying wastebaskets in Building C for 2 years. What happens now? Davidson asked, closing the file. Kane was quiet for a long time, looking at his hands that had once been steady enough to thread a needle at 1,000 yards, gentle enough to provide medical aid to wounded enemies, strong enough to carry dying friends through landscapes that belonged in nightmares. Now I go back to work. The floors aren't going to mop themselves, but Davidson wasn't finished. The country owes you. The country told me to disappear. I did. We're even. What if we need you again? Kane looked up at him then, and Davidson saw something in those gray eyes that made him remember why men like Samuel Kane were worth being afraid of and worth fighting alongside in equal measure. Then you know where to find me. Word spreads fast in the military community, especially word about ghosts who turn out to be real. Within a week, Marcus Chen was back at the facility, not for a tour this time, not with a group of other SEALs, just him carrying a cup of coffee and a story he needed to hear from the source. He found Kane in the supply closet at 6:30, restocking paper towels with the same methodical precision that he probably once used to prep weapons and check equipment before missions that never officially happened. Master Chief Kane turned around. Up close, Marcus could see details he'd missed from the hallway. The way Kane's left shoulder sat slightly higher than his right, old injury probably from carrying heavy packs across terrain that wasn't meant for walking. The small scar above his left eye that had the clean, straight line of surgical repair, the calluses on his hands that didn't come from pushing mop handles. You don't need to call me that, son. That rank belonged to someone else. Master Chief Rodriguez told me stories about your unit, about what you guys accomplished. Kane's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. Rodriguez is still teaching. Just retired last year. But yeah, he taught half the guys I came up with. Marcus paused, trying to find the right words. He said you were the best he ever saw at reading terrain, said you could predict where the enemy would be before they knew it themselves. Rodriguez was a good soldier, solid operator. He said you saved his life twice. Kane shrugged, the gesture of a man who'd learned not to take credit for doing what needed to be done. We all saved each other. That's how it works. Marcus had come with a dozen questions, but now that he was here face to face with a legend who looked like any other aging veteran trying to make an honest living, only one question mattered. Would you tell me about them, about your team? Kane was quiet for so long that Marcus thought he'd overstepped, asked for something that couldn't be shared. But then Kane reached into his back pocket and pulled out a wallet that looked older than Marcus was. From it, he carefully extracted a photograph that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were white. 8 men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning like they owned the world. They looked impossibly young, the way soldiers always look young in photographs taken before the weight of what they've seen settles into their faces permanently. That's Tommy Rodriguez, Kane said, pointing to a stocky guy with a mustache and eyes that were already older than his face. Best demolitions expert I ever worked with could thread a needle with C4, disable an IED with a pocket knife and steady hands. Kid from El Paso who sent half his pay home to his mother every month. He pointed to the next face, Jake Morrison, computer specialist from Ohio who could hack anything with a keyboard in 15 minutes. Looked like he should be in a library somewhere. But I saw him take out 3 enemy fighters with a sidearm in a firefight that lasted 6 seconds. Each face got a story. Each name got remembered. Danny Walsh, the medic from Boston who'd saved more lives than he'd taken and considered that a point of professional pride. Kevin Park, the sniper from Seattle, who could put a round through a quarter at 800M and never bragged about it. Michael Stevens, the radio man who could establish communication with anyone anywhere using equipment that shouldn't have worked and determination that always did. David Chin, no relation to Marcus, just one of those coincidences that makes the world feel smaller than it is. The point man who had reflexes like a cat and instincts that kept them all alive until the day they didn't keep him alive anymore. And James Liu, the team leader who'd recruited them all, trained them all, and died with them all in a mountain that wasn't supposed to exist during an operation that never officially happened. They were good men, Kane said finally, folding the photograph carefully and putting it back in his wallet. They deserved better than what they got. Marcus listened to every word, every story, every detail about operations that had never officially happened, but had disrupted enemy supply lines, rescued captured allies, and eliminated threats that would have cost American lives if they'd been allowed to continue existing. He listened to stories about nights spent motionless in hostile territory, about missions that went perfect according to plan, and missions that went completely sideways and had to be salvaged with improvisation and pure stubborn refusal to quit, about the weight of keeping secrets and the heavier weight of carrying the memory of men who died, believing their country would remember their sacrifice. What happened? Marcus finally asked. In the mountain? Kane was quiet for a long time. Then we found something we weren't supposed to find. And some people decided it was easier to bury us than deal with what we discovered. But you survived. I survived. They didn't. And every day for 20 years, I've tried to figure out if that makes me lucky or cursed. Marcus thought about that, about living with survivors' guilt and classified secrets and the weight of being the only witness to sacrifices that couldn't be acknowledged. What happens now? He asked the same question Davidson had asked. Kane looked at the photograph one more time through his wallet, then carefully put it away. Now I go back to work. Someone's got to keep this place clean. But something had changed in those moments of remembering. Maybe it was having someone who understood what the tattoo meant. Maybe it was remembering that once upon a time he'd been part of something bigger than himself, something that mattered in ways that couldn't be measured by medals or recognition. Or maybe it was just knowing that the stories wouldn't die with him. That somewhere a young SEAL would remember the names and faces of men who'd served in silence and died in shadow. 2 months later, when a crisis erupted halfway around the world that required exactly the kind of skills Samuel Kane had spent 30 years developing and 20 years trying to forget, the call came to the janitor's closet. Not to Ghost 6, not to Master Chief, to the man who'd been invisible so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The facility was under lockdown, not because of an external threat, but because of an internal one. Someone had been using the secure networks to run unauthorized operations, selling classified information to hostile actors, using American intelligence assets for personal gain. Sound familiar? The investigation had stalled because whoever was responsible knew the systems too well, had access that was too high level, and was covering their tracks with the kind of expertise that only came from years of working inside the machine. They needed someone who could think like the enemy, because he'd been forgotten by the people who'd created that enemy in the first place. Someone who understood how the system worked because he'd helped build it, and who understood how it could be broken because he'd been broken by it. "We need you," Colonel Davidson said, standing in the doorway of the supply closet like he'd materialized out of nowhere. Kane looked up from the inventory sheet he'd been filling out, the same inventory sheet he'd filled out every Tuesday for 2 years. "No," he said simply. "You need Ghost 6, and Ghost 6 is dead. What if I told you the person we're looking for was involved in what happened to your team?" Kane's hand stopped moving across the paper. He looked up at Davidson with those gray eyes that had seen too much and learned too little about letting go. "I'd say you're 20 years too late. What if I told you he's not finished? That he's been using his position to get people killed? American soldiers, people like the men you served with." Kane set down his pen very carefully. "Then I'd say, you'd better tell me everything." And for the first time in 20 years, Samuel Kane stopped mopping floors and started hunting. The operation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Kane, moving through the facility like the ghost he'd trained to be, observing patterns, cataloging behaviors, identifying weaknesses in security protocols that hadn't been updated since before he'd started pushing a mop cart through these hallways. The target was Assistant Director Marcus Kellerman, a man who'd built his career on the graves of better soldiers and funded his retirement with the blood money of betrayed operations. A man who'd been selling American secrets for so long that he'd forgotten they weren't his to sell. A man who'd been one of the two civilians in expensive suits who'd given Samuel Kane a choice that wasn't really a choice 20 years ago. Kellerman had gotten sloppy. Success breeds overconfidence, and overconfidence breeds mistakes. He'd been using the same communication protocols for years, routing payments through accounts that were secure but not invisible, meeting with contacts in locations that were private but not unobservable. All things that a man trained to notice Kane would eventually notice given enough time and motivation. The takedown happened on a Thursday night. Kellerman was leaving his office late, heading to a car that would take him to a meeting that would never happen with people who would never arrive. Because Samuel Kane had spent 3 weeks learning Kellerman's routines. And tonight, those routines were going to change permanently. FBI agents were waiting in the parking garage. So were investigators from military intelligence, the CIA, and departments that didn't have names or business cards. Evidence had been gathered, accounts had been traced, and communications had been intercepted. All of it legal, all of it admissible, all of it devastating. When Kellerman saw Samuel Kane standing in the shadows near his car, recognition flickered across his face like lightning. "You're supposed to be dead," he said. "So are a lot of good men," Kane replied, "but only one of us deserved it." Kellerman went quietly. Men like him always do when the game is finally over, and the only choice left is how they want to be remembered. The facility returned to normal within a week. New security protocols were implemented. Background checks were strengthened, and the investigation expanded to identify anyone else who might have been part of Kellerman's network. Samuel Kane went back to mopping floors, but word had spread through certain channels about the janitor who'd helped bring down a 20-year conspiracy, about the ghost who'd come back to finish a mission that had started in a mountain cave on the other side of the world. Marcus Chen, who'd been promoted to instructor since their first meeting, made a point of stopping by the facility whenever his duties brought him to the area, not for official business, just to check in on an old soldier who'd become something like a mentor, even if neither of them would have used that word. "You could have anything you wanted now," Marcus said one evening, finding Kane in his usual spot, restocking supplies with methodical precision, full reinstatement, back pay, Medal of Honor probably. Kane smiled slightly. It was the first time Marcus had ever seen him smile. "I've got everything I need, son." "What's that?" "A job that matters, stories that got told, and the knowledge that sometimes the system works the way it's supposed to." Marcus nodded, understanding more than he'd understood when this all started. "Your team would be proud," he said. Kane looked at him, and something in his expression had changed. The weight was still there. That would never go away. But it was different now. Shared maybe, or at least acknowledged. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think they would be." 6 months later, Samuel Kane retired from his position as maintenance supervisor at Langston Naval Research Annex, not because he was forced to, but because he was ready to. His replacement was a young veteran named Sarah Mitchell, a former Army intelligence analyst who'd lost her leg to an IED in Syria and needed a job that would let her serve her country without requiring her to carry a rifle anymore. Kane trained her personally, showing her not just how to clean the facility, but how to observe it, how to notice patterns, how to see things that other people missed. "Why are you teaching me this?" she asked one day. "Because invisible doesn't mean powerless," he said. "Sometimes it means the opposite." On his last day, Marcus Chen showed up with a gift, a small metal plaque, the kind that might sit on a desk or hang on a wall. It read, "The best soldiers are the ones you never hear about. The best victories are the ones that never make the news. The best service is the kind that expects no recognition and gets none." Below that, in smaller text, in memory of MWD Kilo, who served in silence and died in shadow, but whose sacrifice echoes in the freedom of those who never knew their names. Kane held the plaque for a long time, running his thumb over the engraved letters. "Thank you," he said finally. "Thank you, Master Chief." And for the first time in 20 years, Samuel Kane didn't correct the rank, because sometimes the quietest man in the room has already done the loudest things. And sometimes, when the world forgets about you, that's exactly when you're needed. Oh, sometimes being invisible is the most important job of all. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to subscribe. Subscribe to Graceful Valor Stories, where quiet strength is celebrated and every hero's story finds a voice. There's another powerful veteran story waiting right here on the screen. Click to watch it and let me know in the comments. Have you ever met someone who turned out to be far more than they seemed?